Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Amerikahaus Munich, I would like to welcome you to a very special discussion with Dr. Clayborne Carson. Dr. Clayborne Carson has devoted most of his professional life to the study of Martin Luther King Jr. and the movements King inspired. He teaches at Stanford University, where he has served as Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor of History, now emeritus. In 1985, the late Coretta Scott King invited Dr. Carson to direct a long-term project to edit and publish an authoritative edition of her late husband's speeches, sermons, correspondence, publications, and unpublished writings. Under Carson's direction, the King Papers Project has produced 7 volumes of the papers of Martin Luther King Jr. In 2005, Carson founded the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute to endow and expand the educational outreach of the King Papers Project. Although he is completing his final year directing the King Institute, he will continue to his research and teaching as a senior fellow at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. After Dr. Carson offers us a few words, Dr. Andreas Edkas will join him in a discussion. Dr. Andreas Edkas teaches American history at LMU Munich and has curated several historical exhibits. He is the founding member of the International Federation for Public History and co-editor of the e-Journal International Public History. Following their discussion, we will open the floor for questions from our audience. You're welcome to post any questions you may have in the YouTube live stream chat, or you may send your questions to event@amerikahaus.de, event@amerikahaus.de. It is now my honor and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Clayborne Carson. The floor is yours, Dr. Carson.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's wonderful to be in Germany again, even if virtually. I've really enjoyed my times there and have lots of friends who have stayed in touch with me over the years. So it's particularly good for me to speak to this audience. I think what I'd like to do in just a couple of minutes is lay out why I've chosen the theme, where do we go from here, as my general theme for this year, in part because it's King's last book, and that question has always intrigued me. Where do we go from here? Because when I think back when King was writing it, he was near the end of his life. He did not know, of course, that his life would end the next year after the book was published. But I think he was reflecting back on what had been accomplished and what had not been accomplished by the civil rights reforms of the 1960s. By 1967, when the book came out, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had been passed. The next year, the Voting Rights Act was passed. And these 2 major pieces of legislation changed the course of American history. They were the main achievements of what we call the civil rights movement. But King was unsatisfied. He felt that the movement was about something deeper and more radical in some ways, changing the economic structure. He had begun to talk about the 3 evils of the world. One of them, of course, was racial discrimination, but also poverty and war. So that was the focus of his final years. At the time of his assassination, he was leading a poor people's campaign to push Congress to pass sweeping legislation to deal with the issue of poverty. And he understood that poverty was a worldwide problem. So I think the last years, when he asked that question, where do we go from here? He was asking a question that was, I think, more difficult to answer. I think we still haven't answered it. He understood that the question was based on his notion of where here was. Where was, where was America at that time? Where was the world at that time? And he felt that his original goals as a minister and as a civil rights leader had not been achieved. He was disappointed that the country had not moved more rapidly and that the world had not begun to address the problems of poverty and war. So here for him was a place where the movement was not ending, but a new movement was starting. So I think that today we are still looking at King's unanswered question and realizing that the world has not changed in many fundamental ways from where it was in 1967. And I think part of the answer to that is that the crucial part of that question is, who are we? He was addressing Americans as a whole and saying that from here we need to go to a different and better place. We needed to deal with problems that had been around for a long time and indeed are still very pressing questions for the world. So I look at that question as King's unanswered question as being vital for today. Because we can't really answer the question of where are we to go unless we know who we are. And for America, for the United States, that question has become complicated in recent times. You know, we've found that identifying who are we as Americans, we have to recognize that we're a divided nation like many other nations, divided politically, divided racially, divided in terms of religious beliefs. And the last election in the United States indicated that in some ways we have different realities, believe in a different set of facts. So that question of who we are is perhaps the essential part of answering the question, where do we go from here? I think that there's been a lot of reflection in America over the past year with the Black Lives Matter movement. I was very encouraged by that movement. I was at the March on Washington in 1963, but in just a few days after the murder of George Floyd, protests on a scale far beyond the March on Washington, probably 10 times that many people protested within days of that. And that in itself was a reflection of the changes in the country and in communications using social media, and young people, of course, taking the leading role. When I look back at the March on Washington, and I was so impressed to see 200,000 people at the Lincoln Memorial, and some of the best organizers of that day had spent months organizing that. But young people last spring brought together many times that many people in just a few days because they had mastered the skills necessary to utilize social media. So this was a great deal. This was encouraging to me in the sense that young people who are being shaped by the main forces of the 20th century are, I think, beginning to address some of the questions that King was posing at the end of his life. I think if he were still alive in his 90s now, he would be also very encouraged by what he saw. But soon after that, of course, we saw the election, and we saw what happened on January 6th, and we saw how divided the country is. Some of that is generational. You have a generation of young people growing up. They have never lived through the Cold War. That's not part of their consciousness. And I think that's one of the things that makes them more open to a variety of ideas. I think that young people today, when they look at something like the videos of George Floyd's last moments on Earth, one of the things I think I thought about was that if only people over 30 were around to respond to that, I don't think there would have been a massive protest. I think people of my generation would have said, yes, that was terrible, horrible to watch, but I've seen it before and I'll probably see it again. Through young people's eyes, they could look at that and say, yes, that might have happened before, but I've never seen it before and I don't want to see it again. So I see hope, but I also see a danger, not just in the United States, but I think throughout the world, in terms of that basic sense of common identity that is essential to any nation, to the notion of citizenship. Who is a citizen? Who deserves citizenship rights? All of this are problems that I think Martin Luther King anticipated. And I think that any of you who are interested in his reflections should look back at that book where he talked about the world house, that we have inherited a world house filled with people of different cultures, different races, different economic status. And yet we have to learn to live inside the world house peacefully and productively. And he posed the options. It's either chaos or community. So with that, I'll throw it open for comments. But I also look forward to discussing this. So we could start that part of our webinar right now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carson. I will now hand it over to Dr. Edkas, and the two of you can continue a discussion. So many compelling things already to think about. So the floor is yours.
Joanna. Thank you, Clayborne, for those introductory remarks. I last semester taught a class on cartoons, and I also, with my students, looked at a number of cartoons from the Obama years. And during the presidential campaign, when he won, there were a number of references to some of King's famous speeches. You know, you had "I Have a Dream," which is now being fulfilled. You had, you know, part of what was in his famous last speech in Memphis. I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. And then after, well, then clearly there were too many expectations for someone like President Obama to fulfill. But I think we, not just as historians, sometimes see history as kind of a progress to the better. And that's how we maybe to a large degree can also truly describe the civil rights movement of having achieved a number of things. And then you have this incredible backlash after the first Black president, who wasn't really a radical president in so many ways. Are Americans, or were Americans, not ready for the first Black presidents? How would you explain that very, very strong reaction to the Obama presidency? And when people thought, well, finally one of King's dreams is being fulfilled.
Well, I think the way I would answer your question is that in some ways, that was a continuation of the reaction to the changes of the mid-1960s. In the United States, we talk about the backlash, the white backlash against Black militancy, against the changes that King was so proud of, you know, the passage of civil rights legislation, the potential for much greater change. And of course, he was leading a poor people's campaign. But I think what we found is that there was a strong reaction among a segment of the white community that is still with us today. We look at the election of Richard Nixon in 1968, and we see what was called the Southern Strategy. And that was to bring tens of millions of Southern whites who had always voted for the Democratic Party, because, you know, that was the dominant party in the South since it was founded. and then switched over to the Republican Party. It was the largest movement of voting sentiment in American history. And we still see that today. We still see that the Republican Party, which had been a Northern party actually when it began, become the dominant party in the South. Now, that was based around the notion that Black people were not going to be voting in the South, or not voting in large enough numbers to be a counterweight to the white vote. But the notion that we, for the last half century, have seen this stronghold of, it's almost like the Republican Party took conservatism from the old Republican Party and combined it with anti-Black kind of racial orientation in the South. And that became not the dominant party in the sense of it was enough voters to win elections. But in a way, even when they won elections, many times it was with the minority of the national vote. So I think that the only thing I saw hopeful in the last election is that perhaps that is changing in the South, not because white voters are moving in large numbers to a more progressive position on racial issues, but because the barriers to Black voting have been coming down. And 50 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, we're finally seeing the intended consequence of that act, especially in the South. So it's interesting to me that when you look at American elections, they tend to be very tight. They tend to be a few percentage points one way or the other determines the outcome. And what that does is it opens the door to, I guess, what I would call either illegal or ways of suppressing votes, and that combined with the fact that we're not really a democratic nation in the sense that it's simply the majority of votes that wins the presidency. It's the majority of the electoral votes, that relic of the early American history that was intended to be anti-democratic from the beginning. It was meant to give a stronger weight to Southern states even then.
Well, I think we've seen some changes in some of the Southern states. So I would argue that Georgia and Texas we see because of also other white people moving there, but of course also the very strong efforts by people like Stacey Abrams to really organize the Black vote. We see that there is, these states don't forever have to be in Republican hands. There is a chance to win these elections. And you could argue that African-American voters repeatedly made the difference. They saved to some degree Joe Biden's presidential campaign and helped him become the presidential candidate of the Democrats. They clearly helped him win some crucial states. And also regarding Georgia, the two runoff elections, African-Americans, I think, made the difference to at least have the equal number in the House. What does the Biden administration have to do to keep that level of engagement to keep winning elections? Or also, we have the midterm elections in 2 years.
Well, I think it's the same dilemma that is always the case for Democratic presidents, is that in order to keep their coalition together, they have to produce progressive legislation. But if the legislation goes too far, then they risk alienating a segment of the white vote. So that balancing act, and I think we saw it with Obama, that he did not feel strong enough to act on a number of issues that were out there for him. For example, immigration. He just made the decision that that was just not going to be his highest priority. Mm-hmm. And so no substantial immigration legislation got passed. Even the taking up the issue of healthcare reform. He did get that passed, but by the slimmest of margins. Mm-hmm. And
with many compromises in the
with many compromises, and basically passing a piece of legislation that a Northern Republican, George Romney, had implemented. So rather than calling it Obamacare, I call it Romneycare. It wasn't what progressives in the Democratic Party wanted, but I think he rightly understood that that's the best I'm going to get. And he felt that once it was implemented, it would be very difficult to dismantle him. And I think he was right in that. It has, the Republicans have tried, I think, dozens of times to repeal it and have failed every time. So it's, this is the kind of division that I think reflects that deeper division I was referring to of who are we as Americans, as American citizens. It's always been a fraught question in American history, as you well know. That was the underlying cause of the Civil War. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court decision basically saying that the framers had not intended Black people to be citizens ever. So the Constitution did not really apply to, or at least the Bill of Rights did not really apply to Black people. And that was an issue that was fundamental in terms of dividing the country into a very destructive civil war.
You or many people during the campaign in the who supported the Democratic Party were quite unhappy with having Joe Biden come out on top, one of the more moderate candidates, an old white man. And I think you also, I've read from you that you also admitted that he was not would have been your first choice. Looking at the past several months, I would argue that maybe at the point in time that the US is at right now, and I don't think anyone envies him for being president now of the country in the pandemic with a huge economic financial crisis, with the deep political divisions, that maybe he is the right person right now, who also has described himself as kind of the bridge to a new generation. And that new generation, of course, could be Kamala Harris. I think for her, had she been the candidate and had she been elected, it would have been an impossible job right now with all the backlash that Obama experienced. So would you say that as I just described, so Biden might be the right person, the interim person to lead to?
I think so. I think that in a way, the messenger, who is the messenger of matters. I think that if a Kamala Harris, or when we look back at Obama, Obama was not a socialist. He was not a person who was going to, even if he had had the free hand, he would not have brought about radical change in the United States. That was not his background. So a lot of the reason, I guess the resentment of him was based around the fact that he was a Black president. And that was such a shock to many Americans, and particularly that extreme that has been around throughout American history, especially since the Civil War, the extreme racist, from the Klan during the 19th century and into the 20th century. But white supremacy has always been a factor. It's not something where you can look at 40 or 50% of Americans are white supremacists, but it's always been a fringe, and it's always had an impact on American society. And so I think that he set off those alarm bells. Now, someone like Biden is not going to set off the same alarm bells. And I think you're right in the sense that he might be able to get more accomplished simply because people can't look at him and say, here is a Black man who can credibly be called a socialist. You know, that's just not, it's not going to stick too well to Joe Biden. And I think that's his strength. And I think that the people around him are, at least the people who have been getting through and getting confirmed by the Senate to be part of his cabinet and part of his administration, I think overwhelmingly are more progressive than he is. You know, we haven't had it's not a situation where a progressive president is trying to, you know, or even someone like Roosevelt, who was not really that much of a progressive, but because of the situation, he was prepared to move in, at least at the start of his administration, in a way that was quite progressive. And I think that's true of Biden, because he's faced with a crisis, probably as severe as the Great Depression in terms of its impacts. And so he has to come up with some credible solution to those problems. And if he's wise, and I think he is, he will understand that in solving the immediate crisis, he can deal with other issues like income inequality, healthcare discrepancies, you know, all of these other continuing issues. If you frame it in terms of we are responding to this immediate crisis, but implementing programs that will be more lasting, you know, I think he can accomplish a lot.
There's also, of course, going to be the demand and the expectations from people who were part of the Black Lives Matter movement regarding judicial reforms, police reforms, reforms in the system of incarcerating people in the United States, which is the numbers are just shocking to people from outside of the US. And it's also become a huge business, of course, for people building prison cells and running them. But of course, to some degree, the power of the federal government is limited in some of that because it's done on the community level, on the state level. So that will be I think a little harder to, or will be quite hard to achieve too. Another issue, and you mentioned this already as one of the big successes of the civil rights movement, the Voting Rights of 1965, which basically put states and counties that had a history of discriminating against minorities, mostly African-American minorities, basically under federal control, so they couldn't change voting laws without getting the okay from Washington or federal courts. The Supreme Court, with a conservative majority in 2013, struck major parts or declared major parts of the Voting Rights Act, declared it to be unconstitutional. Interestingly, if you look at it, had been renewed several times. The last time in 2006, which was already a time of major political divisions, but nearly every Republican voted for this. Finally, when the Democrats had a majority in the House of Representatives, I think sometime last year, they were able to pass the Voting Rights Act, at least in the House, and John Lewis was allowed in a kind of symbolic gesture to announce the vote. Now there is hopefully a chance in the Senate too. How much has the Supreme Court decision of 2013 hurt voting rights, especially of African Americans? And why is it, you think, urgent to pass a new Voting Rights Act?
Well, I think that the notion that when states change their voting laws, who have a history of racial discrimination in voting, getting clearance from the Justice Department was a way of checking that power to make sure it was not misused. But I think in some ways, that effort on the part of the Southern states has been superseded by changes in the way Americans vote. that Americans don't necessarily have to go to the polls anymore. They don't necessarily have to go to a courthouse to register to vote. You know, when you look back at those civil rights protests where, you know, there was one place in the entire county where you could register to vote. So it was kind of open to intimidation. You just put the police there and just make it a very intimidating process. But vote by mail, you know, register by mail. You know, I think that the drive of Americans white Americans to make voting more convenient has made it much more difficult for voting restrictions to stand. And we saw that during the pandemic, that one of the rationales for widening the possibility for you know, voting before the election, using mail voting, and the convenience of that allowed many Black people who have always had difficulty with the traditional roles. You know, if you're a working class person and you have to vote on a work day, and when you go to the polls after you get off of work, you have to stand in line for hours. You know, that poses a major barrier to voting. And historically, Americans don't vote anywhere near the percentages you find in many other countries in the world. And that's the reason, is that it's always been a tool, you know, initially not just to restrict voting by Black people, but by working class people. You know, that you make it difficult. You make certain that in poor areas you stand in line. You know, in my middle class Palo Alto, I've never waited more than 3 minutes to vote. You know, it's the simplest thing in the world, and you know, I can do it on the way to work. But then when I get home in the evening and see you know, college students waiting in lines in some places, and you know, then I realize that, you know, this is not an accident. This is purposeful. This is designed to make it so discourage voting. So I think that the technology is changing to the point where the efforts of the Supreme Court and many parts of the South to restrict voting are getting outpaced by technological change. Now that doesn't mean that we won't see efforts to make voting by mail harder, or perhaps you know, making it so that you have to do it in a certain time period. So all of that is still to be determined. But I guess I'm hopeful that that we'll reach the point where the turnout in the last election will become the norm, or at least, or even the floor. That we will see that kind of participation in future elections. And if that's the case, then you have this generational gulf of young people. You know, the Black Lives Matter protests were not primarily Black people. They were young white kids, young Asian American kids, young Latinos who were also participating in those protests. So that racial divide in America is not, you know, it's obviously not been eliminated, but I think is becoming less politically potent than it has been in the past.
I was also struck when I looked at public opinion polls that nearly 50% of Americans last fall and summer said they had a positive view of the Black Lives Matter movement in spite of all the propaganda against them. I thought that was quite amazing how many people really considered it as an important and necessary movement.
I should add to that I do hope that, again, we have these immediate crises over the death of specific people, you know, and whose names we could go through. But I hope that there is an effort to deal with the deeper issues. That is, how do you make police accountable to basic human rights? You know, that a policeman does not have the right to take a life, you know, just because somebody's jaywalking, you know, like the latest episode, or because somebody happens to, you know, be raise suspicions. You know, that there's the number of police killings, and you know, anyone can just look on the internet and Wikipedia and see that the number of police killings in the United States outpaces the rest of the world. And we're talking about totalitarian governments. We're talking about places like Nigeria, where the police are completely abusive. But yet, America outpaces them all in terms of police killings. Why is that? Why do we have such a high incarceration rate? And I think a lot of that traces back into American history and how that in particular has been used as a means of racial control.
And when one looks at the 1960s, I mean, both for the Black Panthers and for the American Indian movement, police violence was one of the major reasons to start a movement and to protest. And the American Indian movement founded in Minneapolis, Minnesota, or in Minnesota, and not somewhere in the South, or in Oklahoma or so, where most Native Americans might have lived. I also, for my cartoon class, I actually found, and I discovered Ron Cobb, the cartoonist who did a lot of cartoons for a paper that you worked for, which I also found out or wrote for a while, the Underground Los Angeles Free Press. I was quite impressed by some of his cartoons, which from the late 60s and early 70s, which unfortunately, with copyright, would it be hard to show them here on YouTube. But I will, I wanted to send a link to, but if people look at Ron Cobb with double.net, you'll find his cartoons, especially about racism and on the culture label. And he had one on people protesting police violence. And the policemen were in a shooting range shooting these people with the protest posters. There were several on, well, he didn't use white supremacy, he used the term white power, in one where white power is crushing black power, and the Uncle Sam is on top of a swastika, crushing the black man. And another one that was quite impressive, the white man's burden, which normally is kind of bringing Asian or Africans to civilization. The white man's burden was racism on the white man's shoulder. So some very, very impressive cartoons. But again, as you pointed out, I mean, this is decades later, and there's still the same issues over and over and over again. When Obama in 2015 gave at the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March, just after things had happened in Ferguson, the report had come out, he addressed those who said, well, nothing changed. There has been no progress. And he tried to push back against this and says, well, it's still happening, but it's not systemic racism. It's not endemic anymore. So what, I mean, from some of the things you said, you also seem to come out a little more on the positive side in spite of all these things recurring again and again and again, and still on a somewhat systematic structural level.
I don't think the situation has changed. I think that the reaction of large segments of the population has changed. I think that part of what drove police to be unaccountable were white fears. I mean, you know, the idea of white people having white neighborhoods and seeing these as bastions against not just crime, but against Black people. That, you know, I recall when I moved to Los Angeles in the mid-1960s, going to a party in a predominantly white neighborhood and being questioned, what are you doing walking around? You know, and just, you know, the idea that the police were there to protect and serve the white community, not to protect and serve the Black community. And you know, and in fact, there was kind of an unspoken agreement. You know, you whatever happens in the Black community, as long as it stays in the Black community, was not a great concern of the police. And it was only when crime, drugs, other things entered the white community that it became a concern. And I think that history, we're still coming to terms with that. But the more hopeful thing is that that kind of rigid racial segregation, even in the suburbs, doesn't exist anymore. You know, here I am in Palo Alto. I mean, it's you know, it's these things, these neighborhoods have changed, and now it's still the case, you know, that just in the last year, my granddaughter's fiance was stopped coming into Palo Alto as a Black man, made to stand by the car while they did a check. And this is all over a broken taillight, which is like, it's almost like a, you know, broken taillights shouldn't get you having to stand for a half an hour while somebody's running a background check on you. And it didn't really end for him until he said, you know, I'm a former Marine. And then they kind of looked at him differently and kind of said, oh, yeah. So I think that these changes are still in the works. Fortunately, there will be a new generation of police, I hope, who have more different perspectives, who have grown up going to school with Black people, living in the same neighborhood as Black people, and you know, some of the same people who participated in Black Lives Matter might decide that yeah, let's go in and actually do change the attitudes by simply not being tolerant of racist attitudes. You know, the last place those attitudes should be in the minds of someone who has the power of the gun, the minds of somebody who can make a decision during their work day to kill somebody. That there should be a very high level of expectation about that person and of scrutiny of their attitudes to make certain that whatever they would do to a Black person that they wouldn't do to a white person is just unacceptable. Unacceptable, not because they can get prosecuted later, but because they're not going to be on the police force any longer. And so the change really has to come at all levels in terms of evaluating their behavior. You know, it's very hard to prosecute somebody for murder. You have to prove intent. But you can get rid of them on a police force simply because they're not behaving well.
We are both teach U.S. history, and I think one of the things that I've been amazed by, which also where Black Lives Matter played a huge role, is in the debate about the Confederate flag, Southern monuments, and other things. You earlier mentioned also how important history is, and maybe also in educating a younger generation. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on that, and also what the King Center is doing in those respects, and how important, I mean, these are, I really think, surprising changes in places like Richmond, Virginia, where now kind of the last man standing or sitting on a horseback is Robert E. Lee, but only because this is on state land and not city land. So even in the old capital of the Confederacy, we see federal or Confederate monuments being removed. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think that gets back to my comment about we need to define who we are. And that's more difficult in America than it is in many countries. but I think it's becoming, it's a similar problem in many countries, and that is a lot of countries in the world have been greatly affected by immigration. And so the notion that a certain type of people, in the United States, white Europeans, in Germany, people who are ethnically German, that equation of who are we as a people is a ethnic racial identity. That is changing in just about every country in the world. I mean, it is, and it's because of immigration, because of more exposure to the rest of the world, that we've had to separate what I would call as ethnic and racial identity from citizenship. That citizenship is in many countries becoming more available. You can make a choice. In my students at Stanford, compared with when I came to Stanford, they are ethnically, racially, in terms of background, where did they come from? They're diverse. And that's important even for those who don't plan to come to America to stay, although some will, but those who go back. And there are increasing numbers of American students, as you well know, who make the decision to get part of their education abroad. And so they are exposed to different ideas. So I think that even the concept of ethnic and racial purity is being, it's being questioned at every stage. And I think particularly among, again, young people who have grown up in a more diverse society. And that's going to continue. That's going to remain a generalization. It's going to be very difficult for that to ever be reversed. The idea that that only white Americans can be citizens was supposedly jettisoned 150 years ago. But I think in terms of the minds of Americans, there's still remnants of that. And you see that expressed in white supremacy ideas. But those, that if that group who invaded the Capitol are a representative of that identity, I think that many young people were outraged that happened, but it was not. I don't think there was any sense of fear that ragtag group would actually exercise power ever. And I think that the surprise was that they were able to overwhelm the police force assigned to the Capitol, but that was just a mistake of policing.
Well, it could have been. It could have been much worse, I think, right?
It could have been much worse, but it was still, I think that what it indicated in some ways is how desperate those people must have felt. Because living in that reality, the idea that their guy lost by a lot of votes was just very difficult for them to accept. Mm-hmm. But my guess, if that election happens, if Trump runs again in 4 years, it'll be an even worse defeat. because there were a lot of people who voted for him simply because he's a conservative Republican. But now they know more about him than that. So, I actually kind of hope he stays in Republican politics. I think that he will be. I was surprised actually that that the Republican Party didn't vote to convict him simply to get him out of the way, so he won't be choosing who the next president is or the next Republican candidate is.
Well, he might still be helping to choose or to help choose who's going to run for office for other offices in Congress. But we have a couple of questions, I think. Joanna, do you want to raise those questions from the audience?
Yes, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. We have one question that came in via email, and it's regarding your background, Dr. Carson. Your background is both a photo of Gandhi and King mirroring each other. Can you tell us why you chose this photo and what it signifies?
Yes, it was a photo taken by a friend of mine, Bob Fitch, who was King's personal photographer. And I've always liked it because it was taken inside his office. And he always had that picture of Gandhi on the wall. And I've been to India and seen the original of that and actually have a copy of that. So it also has a significance in that I helped design the King Memorial. And some of you might take a look at the expression on King's face and realize that that is the model for the King National Memorial in Washington. And so it was always and in fact, at the larger picture, you can see him, that he's standing and holding a pen. Now in the memorial in Washington, he's holding a scroll, but that was because the sculptor who made the memorial had a reverse image and put the pen in King's wrong, he's a right-handed person. He put it in the wrong hand, and we had to figure out how to fix that. So we replaced the pen with a scroll. But other than that change, it's the exact same image.
Thank you. We have a question from our YouTube chat. Would it actually, and this is regarding voting, the voting system in the United States. I think that's something that a lot of people here don't quite understand with the Electoral College. Would it actually be realistic to expect the Electoral College to be abolished soon? And if so, what would need to happen for that to go through? And do you think that that's actually possible?
It's improbable for this reason, is that it was purposely designed to give states that are basically agricultural more voting power by each state has electoral votes based on each state gets 2 senators plus representatives based on population. But what that does is it allows small agricultural states to have disproportionate power. And so in American society today, the only way that could change would be a constitutional amendment that would require, I think it's 3/4 of the states to vote for it. So
plus
precisely the states
in Congress, 2/3 majorities in both houses of Congress. So
both houses of Congress, yeah. So so states would be voting against their self-interest in order to get that to pass. Now there are other ways of getting around that people have talked about, that is having a compact among the more populous states that their electoral votes would always go to the national winner of the popular vote. And but then that would be kind of a matter of trust that could probably be it would have to be a legal pact that would make that possible. You'd still have the problem of very close elections. Would that always happen? For example, in the 2000 election, you could have an election where a few thousand votes nationwide might determine the winner of the popular vote, and that count might go on for a long, long time. So I think the chances of it happening would be slight, but I would hope that we would come closer to being a democratic nation. But the idea of people giving up power for the greater good is always a difficult sell.
I agree that basically in these days major constitutional amendments are impossible because of the majorities you need. I mean, while the Electoral College is in the Constitution, the way each state decides on how the votes are split or not, this is not in the Constitution. So there are a couple of states that split the votes. But why would these days the Democrats split the votes in California to give the Republicans like 30% if the Republicans don't do it in Texas and elsewhere? So there could be reforms. But I think one problem in the US in the political system is too that with basically being a two-party system, there's always one that will benefit from it. And as you also pointed out, Clayborne, in the past, most of the last elections in the last 20 years, Democrats won the popular vote. So Republicans, even if they would want to agree to this would mean they're possibly going to lose several more elections until they really change. So that also doesn't help to make changes if one might benefit more from that. There's another question that was posted here. Could you please put the election of 2 Democratic senators in the Georgia runoff elections into perspective, considering a Black reverend and a Jewish man be 2 Trump supporters in a former slave state? What does it say about modern America, and what role does Georgia play in it? And also Reverend Warnock's I mean, he's a special person also connected to King. Maybe you could say a few words about that too.
Yeah, I could have Reverend Warnock's picture behind me because I know him quite well, and he's the pastor of King's former church, and I've come there for listened to him, talked with him. So I was very happy to see him elected, and that was a major shift. It would have been inconceivable 20 years ago to think that Georgia would be represented by a Black senator and a Jewish senator. But I think it's partly changing attitudes. It's also changing demographics, not just young people with different ideas than their parents and grandparents, but it's also migration within the United States, that the urban parts of the South have become much more magnets for people wanting to live in an urban area. And I've lived in Atlanta, so it's a place where I would not have thought of living 50 years ago voluntarily. If I'd grown up there, I guess there would be no choice. But I think increasingly people have found that moving to the South for a Northerner is no longer like moving to a different culture or almost a different nation. It's urban Atlanta is not that different from any other urban area. So I think that change is huge. Within Georgia, what that represents is that now the national divide is within a state. The rural areas are still conservative, quite conservative, and in fact, probably even more conservative, because in many cases, Black people have left the rural areas to come to the cities. And what's going to be the long-term change? I think that that's going to continue. I think that Texas probably will become the next major state to go Democratic. And if that happens, then what's left of the solid South. But I think there's going to be a lot of effort in Texas to stop that from happening. You already saw it in the last election, just making it just very, very difficult for people to register and vote. And since the Supreme Court has kind of said we're not going to interfere in that. Now maybe they will if it becomes too blatant. But it's going to be, and I think that once you get to that point where you have a Democratic majority in a southern state, that's going to apply to the legislature too. So if eventually you could, over time, lessen the political power of conservatives to use laws and regulations as a way of restricting Black voting.
And Joanna has a last question that she got. I just wanted to add that after Mitt Romney lost against Obama as well, and the Republicans again didn't have the majority of the popular vote, which they had with Reagan or others in elections before, there was a major study looking at what is going wrong. How do we have to change as Republicans in order to win presidential elections again? And one was, we have to change. We have to have a broader coalition. We have to get more women, more young people, a broader coalition. There were some pretty smart observations. And then Trump came in and things were worked out one more time for that party. But I think they had been a reckoning, and it's been pushed back. But Joanna, you have a question.
Right, I have one last question that was posted in the YouTube chat, which is touches on what you're talking about, looking also to the forward and change. When do you think there will be or can be a point of deep, maybe even generational change in relation to race in America? Because it often feels like every time we take a few steps forward, we take even more back.
I would hope that that's not the case. I think that over time, the kind of realities, political realities, social, cultural realities that people grow up with change permanently. You don't see, broad cultural shifts among the entire American populace toward, I mentioned before, like, you have young people who grew up after the Cold War ended. And yet in the last election, you found the opponents of Warnock calling him a socialist and thinking that for an 18-year-old, that's going to be the deciding thing. Oh my gosh, he's a socialist, I can't vote for that. Well, that conditioning of 50 years of the Cold War that affected my generation and older people, when you talk to young people today, they have no memory of the Cold War. So they look at that was pretty clear with Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders called himself a socialist and got away with it and won primaries and became a major force, probably more deserving of the nomination than Hillary Clinton in the last election before Trump. So I think that changes about who do people admire? Often the role models for young people are Black. They grew up with the King Holiday. He's as American as George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. As he is part of that American identity that they are growing up with. Um, so I think that became clear with Obama's election that why not? You know, if your high school can elect the black student to be student body president, why can't we elect a black person to be president of the United States? What, you know, it's the quality of the person that counts. But the fact that they have grown up in a situation where many of the cultural leaders, many of the people who they respect and like are not white. And that change is permanent. That you're not going to go back to a time when, you know, there was black music on one side and white music on the other side, and never the twain shall meet. You know, we are a culturally heterogeneous nation, and we will remain so. So that's, these broader. Now, there's going to be that political lag. You know, that I'm basically saying the culture is going to change, and the politics are going to lag behind it. But eventually, that cultural change is going to drive political change.
Okay, Joanna?
Thank you so much, Dr. Carson. Thank you so much, Dr. Edkas. This was a wonderful discussion. It's been such an honor for us to have you as our guest. And it was an honor to listen to you. And I feel more hopeful talking or listening to you. I will pass it on now to my colleague, Dominic Rabe from Amerikahaus for some closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jana. And thanks to everybody for tonight's talk. We would very much look forward if you, dear audience, joined us again soon. Check out our website at amerikahaus.de. Feel free to sign up for our newsletter and follow us on social media for more information on upcoming events. Let me only point out 2 events which are coming up in the next weeks. We sort of touched on it briefly tonight. On Tuesday, March 16th, we cordially invite you to a joint event with the Munich Documentation Center for the History of National Socialism and a discussion with Carolyn Randall Williams about her article in the New York Times about the Confederacy and racism in the United States collective memory. And also I want to mention a discussion on Thursday, March 18th with Cynthia Miller-Idris from the American University in Washington, D.C., where she will present her book, Hate in the Homeland, the New Global Far Right, and talk about her research, including developments in Europe and Germany. That's it for tonight. Have a great evening, stay healthy, and talk to you soon. Thank you.